Welcome to the third in a Legendarium series on ancient Egypt. Today we'll be covering Egypt's most legendary queen, Cleopatra. Her story begins in 332 BC, when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, one of the many nations that he conquered over his career. When Alexander the Great died 9 years later, none of his generals proved strong enough to hold the empire together, and each one took whatever they control. One of those generals, Ptolemy, who had also served as one of Alexander's 7 bodyguards, promoted himself to King Ptolemy I of Egypt, and founded a dynasty that lasted for 13 generations. The Ptolemaic dynasty went on to become one of the most decadent and scandalous dynasties in the ancient world, in large part because of their habit of incest marriage, in which brothers married sisters and even mothers would marry sons. This resulted in most Ptolemaic family members being morbidly obese, having very large bulging eyes, and bloated distended necks. In all probability, Cleopatra would have looked less like a Hollywood starlet and a bit more like a mutant hobbit. Nonetheless, Cleopatra was born around 68 BC, about 270 years after Ptolemy became the first Ptolemaic king of Egypt. She would have spoken Koine Greek as her primary language. Remember, all of the Ptolemies would have been descended from Greeks, and about 1% of Egypt would have spoken Greek, yet those 1% of Greek speakers would have held 100% of the power, much as how Norman French speakers held the power in England in the years following the Norman conquest. Now, when Cleopatra was born in 68 BC, Egypt was ruled by her father, Ptolemy XII. Her father married one of Cleopatra's sisters, Berenice, to one of her cousins, thus continuing the Ptolemaic family tradition of incest marriages. However, Berenice put to the other Ptolemaic family tradition by murdering her cousin husband in his sleep, marrying an ambitious general, and then stealing the throne from her father. Ptolemy XII took Cleopatra, then a girl of 11, into exile. Together they went to Rome looking for help. With a large bribe to a rising political star named Julius Caesar, Ptolemy XII won the use of 3 Eastern legions, and 4 years later he came home and retook the throne. He celebrated by murdering both his son-in-law and his daughter. By the time that she was a teenager, Cleopatra learned 2 things. First, she must have the throne, or else she'd probably be murdered by her own family. Second, she had to have the support of Rome if she wanted the throne. In short, power was life and Rome was power. During the remaining 4 years of his reign, Ptolemy XII married 17-year-old Cleopatra to her brother, the 10-year-old Ptolemy XIII. However, when King Ptolemy XII died a year later, her own brother-husband tried to murder her, and Cleopatra barely escaped in time, becoming an exile for the second time before the age of 18. Around this time, Rome stomped into the picture. Julius Caesar had just defeated his rival Pompey and chased him into Egypt. Ptolemy XIII tried to curry favor with Caesar by giving him the head of his defeated rival, but Caesar was disgusted, as he genuinely respected his rival. Yes, he might have killed him, but he wanted him to die a proper death at the hands of a fellow Roman, rather than having his body mutilated by these degenerate Ptolemies. So Cleopatra's timing was good. One of her servants wrapped her up in a carpet and carried her a half-mile to Caesar's quarters. Inside, the carpet would have easily reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit. However, Cleopatra was not interested in comfort or a romantic liaison at this point. If she didn't win over Caesar, then her brother-husband would likely put her to death. And Caesar, as I've mentioned before, may not have been extraordinarily impressed by Cleopatra's looks. However, he would have been very interested in both taking revenge on Ptolemy for the murder of Pompey, and also if he had an Egyptian queen on the throne who owed her power to him, then he could be sure of Egyptian grain coming in steadily to Roman ports. And so Caesar turned against Ptolemy XIII and crushed his army at the Battle of the Nile. The 13-year-old Ptolemy XIII tried to swim across the Nile, but he was dragged down by the weight of his golden armor and drowned. To cement her position, Cleopatra married her other brother, who became Ptolemy XIV. Arsinoe, Cleopatra's sister, took refuge in the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. And because the temple offered sanctuary As of that time, Arsinoe effectively became untouchable. However, Cleopatra didn't let that bother her. She and Caesar took a victory cruise up the Nile. We can guess what they did during the cruise, as Cleopatra had Julius Caesar's son Ptolemy the 15th Caesarion not long after. Caesarion, by the way, means Little Caesar. For a time, Cleopatra's place was absolutely safe, so safe that she traveled to Rome in 46 BC, living openly as Caesar's mistress. Caesar even built a statue of her in the Temple of Venus Genetrix. However, Caesar's enemies used his liaison with Cleopatra against him. After all, if he supported Cleopatra simply because he fell in love with her, what other influence could she have? Would Caesar force Rome to kneel to a foreign queen? Could Caesar be planning on making himself the king of Rome, just as the Ptolemies made themselves the kings and queens of Egypt? And of course, if you know anything about Ptolemaic family rule in Egypt, I can't say that you blame the Romans for not wanting any part of that. And so these fears about Caesar and Cleopatra helped lead to his assassination in 44 BC, when Caesar walked into the Roman Senate and all of the senators got stabby with him. Needless to say, Cleopatra fled home to Alexandria, Egypt not long after. By the time that Cleopatra returned to Egypt, the Roman Republic was effectively being divided between Octavian, Caesar's heir and grandnephew, and Mark Antony, Caesar's former right-hand man. Octavian got the west, and Mark Antony got the east, which meant that he became Cleopatra's neighbor. Now, with the political situation so unsettled, Cleopatra decided to tie up some loose ends. First, she poisoned her sole surviving brother Ptolemy, with poison being her preferred method for getting rid of enemies at court. Indeed, she tested poisons on her prisoners, lazy slaves, or even unsatisfying partners to see which ones worked fastest, finally settling on aconite, the queen of poisons. As her sister Arsinoe was given sanctuary at the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, no Greek could touch her. So she turned to the Roman Mark Antony, offering herself to him as she had to Julius Caesar. But instead of just a rug, Cleopatra arrived in a gold-plated barge, rowed with silver oars, and powered by purple sails. She herself dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Modern psychologists believe that Cleopatra's theatricality may be a sign of histrionic personality disorder, a condition that drives somebody to always be at the center of attention, and her habit of murdering her relatives even when they didn't pose a direct threat to her is likely a sign of psychopathic tendencies. And while it is tempting to blame her psychopathy on being the product of 13 generations of incest, her psychological condition likely came about from growing up in a court where murder was always just around the corner. Soon enough, Cleopatra and Mark Antony started up another love affair, and to prove his love to Cleopatra, Antony happily invaded the temple of Artemis at Ephesus and murdered Cleopatra's sole surviving family member. However, their love affair was not just political. True, Cleopatra needed Antony's legions to keep power in Egypt, and Antony needed Egyptian grain to keep his empire fed. However, the two genuinely enjoyed each other's company. They even formed a drinking club called the Inimitable Livers, tearing through the streets of Alexandria, roaring drunk, and pranking and terrorizing citizens. However, just as Caesar's enemies used his relationship with Cleopatra against him, so did Octavian use Antony's infatuation with Cleopatra to convince the Senate that Antony had become a loose cannon. He'd gone native. He'd come under the influence of this wicked foreign queen who had bewitched Julius Caesar. And it wasn't hard to convince the Senate to vote for a war against Antony and Cleopatra. At the Battle of Actium, in September 31 BC, Cleopatra herself commanded Egyptian triremes against Octavian's forces. However, things must not have gone well because she soon fled the battle, leaving Mark Antony to his fate. And Mark Antony abandoned the battlefield and followed Cleopatra home like a lost puppy, leaving Octavian with the battlefield. Just 1 year later, in 30 BC, Octavian arrived in Egypt with the legions. Knowing that she would be paraded through Rome in golden chains and pelted with stones by the mob before being executed, Cleopatra killed herself. Now, tradition holds that Cleopatra killed herself by clutching an asp or a cobra to her chest. However, modern toxicology reports suggest that she in fact swallowed poison, the same means by which she had murdered her own brother-husband. A fitting twist of irony, perhaps. And Cleopatra is also important because she was the last queen to rule an independent Egypt. While Greek herself, Cleopatra was the last queen to rule Egypt as an independent kingdom. For 400 years, it would be a province of the Roman Empire, and then the Eastern Roman Empire, the Umayyad Caliphate. It would be another 2,000 years before Egypt was actually ruled by Egyptians again. And that wraps things up for this episode of Channel Legendarium. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did like it, please press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, please leave it in the comment section. Thanks again for joining me, and tomorrow we'll be talking about magic in the Pharaoh's Kingdom.